Over the last several years, many previously banned old school cards have been brought back into the format, such as Change of Heart, Yatagarasu, Harpy's Feather Duster, and Monster Reborn. Pot of Greed, on the other hand, was banned all the way back in 2005, and it's remained forbidden ever since. Back in the day, cards like Pot of Greed and Graceful Charity were some of the best ways to boost your deck's consistency. For a long time, Yu-Gi-Oh! Didn't have too many search effects other than monsters like Sangan, so drawing was one of the main ways to get to the cards you needed. In today's video, we're going to find out why Pot of Greed is still banned after almost 2 decades. Pot of Greed has one of the shortest effects in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! You simply draw 2 cards. No restrictions, no drawback, no setup required. Admittedly, this effect does look pretty unassuming, especially to non-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. Unlike a lot of other card games, Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have a mana or resource system, so draw spells have to be greatly restricted. When you use Pot of Greed, you trade your 1 spell for 2 cards, which is a +1 in card economy, and because Yu-Gi-Oh! Has no resource system, you can usually use those cards immediately. If Pot of Greed was legal right now, it would see play in 99% of decks. It is just that good. Pretty much the only other ban card that you can say that for is Graceful Charity, another broken draw spell. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that casual decks would be better against meta decks if they had access to Pot of Greed, because the meta decks would also be playing Pot of Greed. And while it might not seem like drawing 2 cards really matters to the meta decks because they're already so consistent, if you've played competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! You probably already know that even the best decks brick from time to time. If they don't brick though, and they open Pot of Greed, that means that they not only have access to their normal combo, but also the potential to draw into hand traps or extenders. To get a better understanding about why Pot of Greed is so good, let's talk about the other draw 2 spells that have been released throughout Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history. The best place to start is by looking at the other pot spells that also draw 2 cards. These were of course released after Pot of Greed, and they tried to balance the draw 2 effect in a number of ways. Pot of Avarice is a normal spell released in 2005 that says target 5 monsters in your graveyard, shuffle all 5 into the deck, then draw 2 cards. At first glance, this might look like an upgraded Pot of Greed because it not only draws 2 cards, but it recycles your graveyard. And throughout Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history, Pot of Avarice has gone up and down in the metagame, but it's never been quite the power level of the original Pot of Greed. One of the most important aspects of Pot of Greed is that it requires no setup. You can use it immediately to help fix your hand. Not only does Pot of Avarice not help you get out of a bricky hand, it also contributes to the brick itself by giving you a dead draw. While shuffling back 5 monsters with Pot of Avarice is a beneficial effect, it does require your deck to already be functioning. Now don't get me wrong here, even though it's not as good as Pot of Greed, it is still a very powerful card. It was banned back in 2013. However, when they put Pot of Avarice to 3 copies per deck back in 2020, it was not very popular. What this tells us is that Avarice's restriction of requiring 5 monsters in grave hasn't aged all that well. And that is saying something because in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a lot easier to put 5 monsters into the graveyard on turn 1, and yet it is still not played. And of course, another issue is that because a lot of monsters these days have graveyard effects, you wouldn't really want to shuffle them back anyway. It should come as no surprise then that a card like Pot of Dichotomy struggled to be successful. This card says at the start of your main phase 1, target 3 monsters with different types in your graveyard, shuffle all 3 into the deck, then draw 2 cards. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn that you activate this card. In pretty much every way, this is a worse card than both Pot of Greed and Pot of Avarice. They have added 3 new restrictions on it that make it very difficult to use. Despite some players trying this card out when it was released, it never got a chance to see widespread use at tournaments. Pot of Riches is kind of in the same boat. This was released in 2015, and it says shuffle 3 pendulum monsters into the deck from your graveyard and or face up from your extra deck, then draw 2 cards. You can only activate 1 Pot of Riches per turn. You cannot special summon the turn you activate this card except by pendulum summon. Not only is this card hurt by requiring setup, but it also actively goes against what you would want to do in a pendulum deck. For those reasons, it didn't really even see experimentation at any events. After this, they moved on from the graveyard setup angle for trying to fix Pot of Greed. Pot of Desires was released in 2016, and at the time, it was one of the most divisive cards ever released. While some players thought it would be the next coming of Pot of Greed, others thought that it wouldn't even see play. It says banish 10 cards from the top of your deck face down, draw 2 cards. You can only activate 1 Pot of Desires per turn. Compared to Pot of Greed, banishing 10 cards from the top of your deck face down is obviously a huge drawback. When a card is banished face down, it is incredibly difficult to interact with. It is one of the most permanent ways to get rid of a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! In most cases, when you use Pot of Desires, you are figuring that you won't get those cards back. And when you look at it that way, it can seem like a very scary card. You pretty much have to build your entire deck around this by making sure you have multiple copies of your best cards to reduce your chances of banishing them. Of course, sometimes you can just get unlucky and banish all of your important cards, even if you deck built around that. Despite these concerns, Pot of Desires was incredibly popular on release, and it still sees play in decks to this day. It was hit in the TCG for a little while, and right now it is still limited in the Master Duel format. Much like Pot of Greed, Pot of Desires requires no setup, which is one of the things that makes it so powerful. And it's so important for this discussion because it means we now know what a draw 2 effect is really worth. People were willing to take this huge sacrifice, potentially a game-losing sacrifice, just to get a Pot of Greed. I've read a lot of comments from people over the years saying that the big fix for Pot of Greed is to make it once per turn or once per duel, but Pot of Desires pretty much completely disproves that. I want to make it as clear as I can. Recycling Pot of Greed usually isn't even part of the discussion when people talk about bringing this card back. It is just an individually strong card, even if you only use it once. A few years later, in 2019, we got Pot of Extravagance. Let's see what this one does. At the start of your main phase 1, banish 3 or 6 random face down cards from your extra deck face down, draw 1 card for every 3 cards banished. For the rest of this turn after this card resolves, you cannot draw any cards by card effects. It might seem a bit strange that it specifies random face down cards in your extra deck, but basically that just means you won't banish your face up pendulums. Unlike Pot of Desires, which forces you to build your main deck differently, Pot of Extravagance forces you to build your extra deck differently. Pot of Desires is good, but it doesn't work in every deck. Some strategies have one-ofs that they absolutely cannot banish, otherwise they don't function, and in those decks, Pot of Desires doesn't really make a lot of sense. So when they released Pot of Extravagance, a lot of decks that couldn't play Pot of Desires suddenly had a Pot of Greed option. All you have to do to build around Extravagance is just play extra copies of your most important extra deck monsters. And that's not really too hard, especially in decks that don't really use the extra deck that much. So Extravagance has popped up in all sorts of control decks, but even some non-control decks over the years. Now that we know what people will and won't do for a +1 with a Pont spell, let's take a look at some other draw spells to see how they were balanced. One of the most common fixes for these draw 2 effects is to make you get rid of another card in your hand. This turns the Pot of Greed's 1 for 2 into a 2 for 2, which is still pretty good, but it does require a bit more setup. Things like Destiny Draw, Trade-In, and Orchestrated Return are very powerful and have seen play in the past, but they do require you to draw a specific card to discard. These cards are best paired with monsters that have graveyard effects so that you get some extra value. Of course, if you're putting these cards into your deck, you'll probably make sure you have plenty of discard options, but even in that case, it'll never be as guaranteed as a card like Pot of Greed. At this point, we have a trade-in effect for levels 6 through 10, but a lot of the more recent ones haven't seen any play. I do appreciate when they give these draw effects one more bonus effect to make them a bit better. Solar Recharge, Pantheism of the Monarchs, and Cards of the Red Stone are all good examples of this. Recharge Mills, Pantheism gives you a search, and Cards of the Red Stone gives you a Foolish Burial. These cards are interesting because they do still require you to have a discard in the first place if you want to activate them, but if you are able to use them, you might possibly set yourself up for a +1, which means it's a 2 for 3 instead of a 2 for 2. It doesn't happen too much anymore, but there are some cases where instead of giving them a bonus effect, they gave them a bonus drawback. Cards from the Sky and Cards for Black Feathers turn off your ability to special summon the turn you use them. These cards aren't necessarily unplayable, but they are a bit more awkward to use. Another category of draw 2 spells makes you get rid of a card on field instead of getting rid of a card in hand. Draw spells are at their best when they're starter cards, so by requiring you to have a card on board, these ones are definitely worse than your average draw spell. 2 for 2 draw spells aren't very common these days, but I will say that there are ones that do still see play. Allure of Darkness is by far the best one. It was very powerful on release and it's still good today in dark decks, and Trade-In does pop up every once in a while. Solar Recharge and Pantheism still see play in their dedicated archetypes, and I think that one of the reasons is because they have those bonus abilities. It's important to remember that when a lot of these cards were released, Ash Blossom didn't exist. These days, if you activate a 2 for 1 draw spell and your opponent has an Ash Blossom, you're in a pretty bad spot because they only lost 1 card while you lost 2. While not a draw 2 spell, one card that I wanted to mention is that Upstart Goblin was very popular between 2014 and 2016, so popular in fact that it got limited. Upstart Goblin only draws 1 card, so when compared to Pot of Greed, it sure looks a lot worse. But people played it at that time period because they really wanted to decrease their deck size by 40 to effectively 37 by putting blank cards into their deck. While it is true that search effects are more popular than draw effects in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, keep in mind that Desires and Extravagance do still see play. Searching cards is good, but things like Pot of Greed can get you to not only those search effects to make your deck a little bit more consistent, but they can also draw into non-engine cards that you don't have a way of searching, like Evenly Matched and Lightning Storm. I understand that Pot of Greed still being banned can be confusing to both old school players and non-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, but hopefully after watching this video you can now understand what makes it so powerful. It's incredibly unlikely that Pot of Greed will ever be unbanned, but if it ever was, I would think it was more for marketing rather than that it was okay in the format. At the end of the day, while the power level of modern cards is really high, we still don't really have cards like Pot of Greed that are generic +1s that any deck can use. Anyway though, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion. I'll catch you later though. Goodbye.